The flashbulbs flickered in rhythm as Hugh Jackman smiled through clenched teeth on a Los Angeles red carpet, flanked by Ryan Reynolds on one side and Blake Lively on the other. His tuxedo fit like armor, and the crowd cheered like nothing had changed. But inside, something had. For 30 years, he had played the loving husband, the devoted father, the example of longevity in a world built on divorce headlines. And now, it was all unraveling. Just out of frame, Deborah Lee Furness watched from a hotel room balcony in New York, her phone buzzing with texts from friends and headlines that refused to stop multiplying. Her face held stillness, but her eyes betrayed the storm. "They're already repositioning him," she murmured to herself. Ryan's grin, Blake's perfect posture, everything looked orchestrated. She knew this game. She had taught Hugh how to play it. What the world hadn't seen was the silence between her and Hugh in the last year. The rehearsed smiles at awards shows the growing void between two people once inseparable. Then Sutton Foster's name started appearing on playbills and in rehearsal schedules. Deborah had noticed the way Hugh's voice softened when talking about her. The spark he tried to hide, he'd deny it, of course, but emotional betrayal doesn't need a kiss, it just needs a shift in where you lay your secrets. For months, Deborah said nothing. She was no stranger to the industry. But when the New York Times called their separation mutual and amicable, something inside her snapped. That's not what it felt like. That's not what it was. She finally released a statement, deliberate, poetic, razor-edged in its restraint. Words like betrayal, boundaries, liberation weren't chosen by accident. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. Those words carried a weight that landed directly on Hugh's PR-crafted shoulders. And behind them, murmurs started to spread. Whispers of no prenup, of a fortune built during a marriage where she had stepped back, stayed home, raised children, and let his career fly. Now, insiders whispered that she was seeking a share of the empire she helped build. Not out of spite, but justice. She'd been there when the agents first called, when the stage lights were still foreign. She remembered helping him rehearse lines at their kitchen table while the kids slept. That wasn't charity. That was partnership. Back in LA, Hugh laughed politely at a joke Ryan cracked about Wolverine making a comeback. But his eyes darted briefly toward Blake. She was adjusting her dress strap, face unreadable, and Hugh knew, somewhere behind her smile, calculations were being made. Blake and Ryan didn't align themselves for sentiment. They aligned for optics, and if he wasn't careful, they'd spin the fallout around him just as quickly as they'd embraced him. Deborah knew that, too. The alliance with Hugh during the divorce wasn't just friendship, it was PR insurance. Taylor Swift had already distanced herself. A missed AMA appearance here. A skipped dinner there. It didn't take much for the internet to start filling in the blanks. Deborah stood by her window and scrolled through social media. The headlines were shifting. One from the Daily Mail read, "Deborah Lee Furness breaks her silence at betrayal." Another from Variety, "Jackman's return to Wolverine. A strategic move, post-divorce." She smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in clarity. The narrative wasn't escaping her fingers. Not this time. And across town, in a production meeting for Deadpool 3, Ryan scrolled his own phone and saw a new trending tag. Hashtag, Deborah deserved better. He didn't say anything, neither did Blake. But later that night, they turned off the comments. On their latest Instagram post, they knew the internet had chosen a side. And for once, it wasn't theirs. The room was silent as Hugh Jackman sat at the long oak table. The kind of silence that wraps around you when even the lawyers know the truth stings. Across from him sat Deborah Lee Furness, hands folded, eyes steady, expression unreadable. They weren't here for drama. They were here for division. 30 years of life. Love, sacrifices, and stardom were about to be cataloged into spreadsheets and asset lists. The lawyer cleared his throat. But Hugh barely heard. His thoughts were with the words Deborah had used in her statement. Betrayal, boundaries, liberation. They clung to him like sweat. He remembered when she had said she didn't believe in prenups. If we're in this for life, what's there to divide? That had sounded romantic in 1996. Now it felt like a loaded pistol, placed gently in the center of the table. Without a prenup, every dollar he earned from X-Men, The Greatest Showman, Logan, every perfume deal, and theater box office hit were all on the line, and she had been there for it all. At home with the kids while he traveled to premieres, editing scripts with him late into the night, turning down jobs to follow his dream. She wasn't just a wife. She was a co-founder in the Hugh Jackman brand. And now, the reckoning had arrived. Across the country, Blake Lively refreshed her phone again. The headlines weren't kind anymore. One celebrity blog declared, Blake and Ryan abandoned Taylor to side with Jackman in divorce. Fallout. Another post speculated whether Lively's PR team was feeding negative stories to bury Deborah's statement. Blake threw her phone across the couch and exhaled. Taylor wasn't answering her texts, and she knew why. Taylor's team had caught wind of something, a leaked email. A quiet whisper that Blake's people had worked behind the scenes to discredit Deborah. It didn't matter that Blake hadn't directly approved it. In the court of public opinion, guilt by strategy was still guilt. Ryan Reynolds, meanwhile, was pacing in his home office. Disney had called twice. His team told him to lay low, avoid comment, avoid new headlines. But the problem was, he was the headline now. His bromance with Hugh, once a comedic bit of Hollywood fun, was now being reinterpreted. Every Instagram joke, every late-night skit, was fuel for conspiracy. Was this all one big PR machine to distract from Hugh's personal implosion? Were Blake and Ryan covering for Hugh? Worse, were they sacrificing a 30-year marriage to keep the Wolverine franchise intact? And then came Sutton Foster. She had remained silent through the firestorm, but a fan account posted a photo of her and Hugh having coffee just days before Deborah filed. It went viral. The comments weren't kind. Some called her a homewrecker. Others defended her, but the damage was done. Even silence could be interpreted. Deborah saw the photo too. She stared at it longer than she meant to. Not because it proved anything, but because it confirmed what she'd long suspected: she wasn't in the story anymore. Back at the lawyer's table, Deborah gently closed the folder in front of her. She looked at Hugh not with anger, not even with sadness, but with finality. "You'll be fine," she said. "You always land on your feet." He wanted to respond. Wanted to say she had always been the reason he landed at all. But the moment passed, and so did she. She stood, adjusted her coat, and left the room with the grace of someone who knew that dignity wasn't something the tabloids could give her. "Take away, Dot." The door clicked shut behind her. And just like that, the man who once seemed invincible was left in the quiet with nothing but headlines, memories, and a growing awareness that maybe, for the first time, he wasn't the hero in this story. Deborah Lee Furness stepped out of her brownstone. Her umbrella tilted against the wind. The press camped just across the street under soggy tarps. She didn't flinch. She didn't wave. She didn't say a word. But the Daily Mail had already published her statement, and the world had already decided. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a reckoning. Inside her home, the living room still had pieces of Hugh's presents framed, family photos, a signed Greatest Showman poster, and a knit blanket he'd bought during a winter shoot in Prague. But they were only artifacts now. The man behind them had moved on. The statement had been short, poetic, sharp. Words like boundaries, integrity, and liberation weren't chosen lightly. They were scalpel words, precise and deliberate. She wasn't naming Sutton Foster. She didn't have to. The Broadway whisper machine had already filled in the blanks. Every behind-the-scenes smile during the Music Man rehearsals. Every compliment Foster gave Jackman in interviews. Every moment of chemistry that now looked less like acting and more like foreshadowing. Back in LA, Ryan Reynolds sat behind the tinted windows of a black SUV, scrolling through his phone as a flood of PR alerts pinged in. "Are you sure we should still show up for Jackman's event?" his assistant asked, cautious. "Absolutely," Ryan replied too quickly. But even he knew this was no longer a casual bromance. His proximity to Hugh had turned into a political liability. Disney executives were nervous. Taylor Swift's team had gone silent. Blake was avoiding mirrors, news feeds, and anyone who might mention Deborah. Meanwhile, Taylor Swift was hiding in plain sight. Her absence at the AMAs wasn't about scheduling, it was strategy. Her team was aware of everything: Blake's silent allegiance to Jackman, the whispers about Sutton, and the looming rumor that Blake's team had tried to manipulate press narratives behind the scenes. And then came the subpoena. Taylor's own company had been dragged into the legal fray, accused of knowing more than they let on. And while Taylor wasn't the one who leaked Blake's moves, many believed her father had a hand in ice, now found herself caught between loyalty and principle. And Taylor Swift does not like being cornered. She stopped responding to Blake's messages. The social media likes disappeared. Fans noticed. "Are Taylor and Blake done?" Trended on X. The quiet answer: yes. Hugh Jackman, meanwhile, was working harder than ever, reprising his role as Wolverine, stepping onto red carpets again, and smiling through the fire. But to those watching closely, it was all too rehearsed. The charm looked automated. The sparkle was duller. People wondered, was this damage control or defiance? When he appeared alongside Ryan at a sports event, joking with Travis Kelce and letting cameras catch him mid-laugh, it felt less like fun and more like strategy. The old Hugh, one who gave heartfelt interviews about family and love, was missing, replaced by a version molded by necessity, not sincerity. And yet, the person whose silence spoke loudest remained Deborah Lee. She wasn't suing for millions. She wasn't doing interviews. She was, instead, living in the quiet space between grief and clarity. She had sacrificed her career, her privacy, and her peace to support Jackman's rise. She'd smiled for cameras, nodded through his flirtations, and raised their children while he became a global icon. And now she was reclaiming the story, one dignified step at a time. In private circles, insiders whispered about Blake Lively's discomfort, how she regretted ever getting involved. Her friendship with Sutton Foster had started innocently, but now every red carpet smile from the past was being dissected. Her alliance with Jackman was turning toxic. Even Ryan, always the PR genius, couldn't spin it fast enough. The Hollywood fairy tale was unraveling. Not just Hugh and Deborah's, but the entire house of cards built on curated friendships, calculated loyalty, and a culture that confused silence for innocence. And for the first time in years, the person everyone had dismissed as the wife was standing at the center of it, all not with accusations, but with truth, not with scandal, but with power. Inside the gated calm of her home in Sydney, Deborah Lee Furness moved slowly through the kitchen, a mug of tea in hand, while her phone buzzed steadily on the counter. She didn't check it. The news was already everywhere. Taylor Swift had pulled her AMA's appearance. Reynolds and Blake Lively were under fire for aligning too closely with Hugh, and the press had begun calling her the quiet hero of the fallout. It felt surreal. For 30 years, she'd been the invisible backbone of Hugh Jackman's myth. Now, the silence was hers to wield, and the world was finally listening. Across the Pacific, Ryan sat in a dim meeting room at Disney's Burbank headquarters, flanked by his legal team. The studio heads weren't smiling. "We're not saying we're cutting ties," one exec began cautiously, "but this PR cycle, this isn't what we signed up for." Ryan leaned forward, hands clasped, that same charming grin he'd used for decades painted across his face. "We're managing it. We're good. This will blow over." But the eyes across from him were cold, unconvinced. Behind the scenes, Disney's internal reports weren't optimistic. They had traced the blowback to one precise turning point: Blake's legal filings. It was Blake who'd named names. Blake who'd attempted to control a damaging narrative about Justin Baldoni. Blake who'd brought Taylor's team into the storm. And now Blake, despite her carefully posed Instagram stories and smiling brunch pics, was in hiding. The emails subpoenaed by Swift's attorneys were real, and so were the behind-the-scenes communications, suggesting Blake's PR team had tried to smear Baldoni as unstable, creepy, unfit to direct. It was a smear campaign dressed in velvet, and now the velvet was soaked in gasoline. Taylor Swift had gone quiet, but not passive. Her team was mounting its own narrative, one built not in tabloids but in courtrooms. At a recent closed-door conference, Swift's legal reps made it known. If pushed, they would testify. Venable Taylor's legal firm had been pulled into discovery, and emails were on the table. No more soft diplomacy. If Blake's team wanted a war, they'd get it with legal filings, sworn statements, and the full weight of the Swift machine behind it. Back in New York, Hugh was filming again. Paparazzi caught him exiting his trailer, smiling faintly, waving, but inside, the mood was icy. The studio had issued new protocols. No more unapproved visitors on set. No more late-night social calls with producers. Sutton Foster had retreated from public appearances, her press junkets canceled. Insiders claimed she'd been advised to let the storm pass. But it wasn't passing. The whispers were growing louder. The Music Man, ethereal or not, had become symbolic, a stand-in for everything that went wrong in the marriage. And then came the anonymous affidavit, filed quietly in the ongoing legal tangle between Lively's team and Swift's lawyers. The document detailed a first-hand account from a crew member who had worked closely with Blake, Hugh, and Ryan during the filming of a recent campaign. The details were chilling. Coordinated efforts to discredit Baldoni, pressure to rewrite lines, emails that suggested planting a friendly story with a known gossip columnist. All of it backed by timestamps, metadata, and screen captured proof. For Blake, the fallout was swift. Margot Robbie unfollowed her. Zendaya's team politely declined a joint promo offer. Ariana Grande passed on a even longtime allies in the fashion world were pulling back, wary of being associated with a scandal that now had legal teeth. Blake's image, once pristine, aspirational, was fraying. Deborah Lee watched it all unfold from her quiet perch in Sydney. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. That wasn't her style. Instead, she wrote. She filled pages of a journal with thoughts about loyalty, identity, sacrifice. She spoke to no press, gave no interviews. But insiders say she's been approached by multiple publishers. A memoir deal is on the table. 7 figures. Still, she hesitates, not because she's afraid, but because she knows that once she tells the whole truth, there's no turning back. Not for Hugh, not for Ryan and Blake, not even for Taylor. Because this isn't just a story about love lost. It's a story about image, how Hollywood constructs it, protects it, weaponizes it, and how one woman, for 3 decades, carried the weight of a brand built on her silence. In a soundproof corner office on the 34th floor of a Manhattan high-rise, Sutton Foster sat across from her publicist, pale and exhausted. "You can't keep dodging this, Sutton," her manager said gently. "It's already out there. You need to say something." Sutton's fingers clutched a lukewarm coffee as she stared out the window, her voice barely audible. "Say what? That I fell for a man who wasn't mine. That I let myself become the villain in someone else's life story." The silence stretched between them. Outside, the city pulsed with energy. But inside, the storm was quiet and personal. Sutton had been Hugh's co-star, his confidant, and if the rumors were true, his emotional escape from a crumbling marriage. But what she hadn't expected was how quickly the spotlight would turn cruel. Meanwhile, inside the Beverly Hills offices of Maximum Effort, Ryan Reynolds was facing his own reckoning. The backlash had started: small cold calls, unreturned, brand partners requesting clarification. But by now, it was undeniable. One luxury label had paused a campaign with him. A top streaming service was re-evaluating upcoming partnerships. Even his whiskey brand was facing internal tension. His team was scrambling, but Ryan wasn't smiling anymore. He'd leaned on his charm for years, but this was different. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a tweet gone viral. This was a narrative slipping through his fingers. And the public, they were no longer buying the act. Blake, for her part, had gone silent. Her lawyers were coordinating with her publicist, but insiders claimed she was growing increasingly isolated. Even close friends were pulling back, unsure whether aligning with her meant getting caught in the crossfire. She weaponized the lawsuit, one industry figure whispered, tried to protect her brand by throwing someone else under the bus. But the problem is, everyone knows now. The gossip wasn't just on Twitter anymore. It had seeped into studio meetings, charity events, even Fashion Week previews. Blake Lively's name no longer sparked admiration. It triggered caution. Back in Sydney, Deborah Lee Furness was preparing to fly out. She hadn't spoken to Hugh since the last financial mediation call, where things had grown tense over asset splits and intellectual property rights. "You're really doing this?" he'd asked, his voice unusually quiet. "I am," she replied, "and I suggest you prepare yourself, because I'm not hiding anymore." She wasn't angry, not in the explosive, tabloid-friendly way the media might have expected. No, Deb's version of rage was sharper, focused, measured, the kind that built momentum quietly and struck without warning. Her plan wasn't revenge, it was reclamation, reclaiming her story, reclaiming the years she'd set aside her dreams for Hugh's, reclaiming the narrative that had painted her as the older, grateful wife instead of the foundational force behind his empire. She wasn't asking for sympathy, she was demanding truth. And as for Taylor Swift, she'd returned to Nashville, away from red carpets and press events, surrounded only by close friends. Those close to her said she was done with the Hollywood PR machine, disgusted by how easily public perception could be manipulated, how allies could turn into liabilities. Blake had crossed a line. Taylor had tried to stay quiet, but Blake had dragged her into the mess, naming legal teams, exposing conversations meant to be private, and cornering Taylor's brand into uncomfortable proximity. The decision had been made. Quietly, permanently, and in the middle of it all, Justin Bull was finally speaking. In a rare podcast interview, he didn't mention names. He didn't point fingers, but he talked about the weight of being misrepresented and how when people in power shape the narrative, it leaves the rest of us fighting to be seen. As human listeners knew who he meant. The timing wasn't coincidental. The podcast went viral within hours. So, what happens next in this strange, tangled saga? Hollywood had started asking different questions now. Not who's innocent or guilty, but who controls the narrative, and at what cost. Because somewhere between PR firms, lawsuits, NDAs, and Instagram silence, the truth had become a casualty. In the dim glow of a late-night studio, far from the red carpets and filtered perfection of Hollywood's social media facade, meeting was underway. Disney's executive legal team sat in silence as a final internal review memo circulated the table. The subject line was unambiguous: liability, risk assessment, Reynolds Lively Association. The conclusions were damning. Every whisper from crew members, every redacted email, every tip that had once seemed speculative was now Blake and Ryan weren't just collateral in someone else's drama, they were active players. And the optics were no longer sustainable. One executive finally broke the silence. "We can't afford to carry their brand anymore. Not with this level of exposure." There was no disagreement. Meanwhile, Deborah Lee Furness, fresh off a long-haul flight from Sydney, stood quietly in the arrivals lounge at JFK, her suitcase at her side and sunglasses shielding her from the flash of photographers who hadn't yet noticed her. She wasn't here for meetings or a media tour. She was here for closure. One final conversation with Hugh. The financial settlement had been finalized. The lawyers had stopped calling. But something deeper needed to be said, not for the headlines, but for herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Your 3 p.m. with Hugh is confirmed. Location secured. Private," she replied with a simple, "On my way." Across town, in a brownstone where blinds stayed drawn for weeks, Blake sat alone at the kitchen table, scrolling through a barrage of unread headlines. Ryan Reynolds' influence strategy implodes. Taylor Swift quietly cuts ties. The PR golden couple finally cracks. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stared, numb, calculating. Her phone lit up. Rian. She hesitated, then answered. "They've pulled back on Maximum Effort," he said. The streaming partner backed out. "We're toxic now." "What about aviation, Jen?" she asked quietly. "Meeting in the morning, but don't get your hopes up." Neither said what they both feared, that everything they'd built was about to slip away, not because of one scandal, but because they overplayed their hand. Their storybook image, the curated couple of American dreams, had cracked under the weight of overexposure and miscalculation. And what of Taylor Swift? She remained silent, but not idle. Her team had quietly scrubbed every pending collaboration with Blake. A trusted producer confirmed that Blake's name had been removed from storyboarding on an upcoming music video. Swift was meticulous when she cut ties clean, thorough, irreversible. A downtown theater, Sutton Foster sat in an empty rehearsal room, staring at the scuffed wood stage. Her manager had advised a break, maybe a retreat overseas. But Sutton had chosen the opposite work. She needed to anchor herself again in something real. Theaters didn't lie. Audiences didn't lie. Her next role would be a stripped-back revival with no red carpets and no interviews. Her only request to the director was, "Don't put my name on the posters. Let the work speak." And Justin Baldoni, a major publisher, had made an offer. A memoir not about the scandal, but about being branded and silenced, about surviving fame's shadows. He hadn't said yes, not yet. But he was writing, by month's end. Variety would publish an expo. A studio insider would leak the full sequence of PR manipulations, falsified timelines, and influencer coercions tied to the Lively Reynolds Baldoni saga. The story would spark a national conversation about celebrity ethics, legal intimidation, and Hollywood's use of narrative warfare. A new phrase would trend: curated collapse. And at a private cafe uptown, Deborah Lee finally met Hugh. They sat at a corner booth, no lawyers, no cameras. Just two people who had once loved each other more than anything. He tried to apologize. She nodded. He reached across the table, but she gently pulled her hand away. "We're not enemies," she said, "but we're not a story anymore, either." As she stood to leave, Hugh asked, "Do you hate me?" "No," she said with a sad smile, "but I don't know you anymore. And maybe you never really knew me." And just like that, she walked out. Not as Hugh Jackman's wife, not as Hollywood's ideal, but as herself, quiet, whole, and finally free. The curtain didn't fall. That date lifted, revealing the truth behind the fiction. And for everyone tangled in that story, the performance was over.